They were the iron fist of the German army. In our minds, the Panzer Divisions of World War II are an unstoppable tide of steel that rolled over Europe. Their commanders were masters of a new kind of war, their crews the elite knights of a modern age. But what if I told you that on one fateful morning, an entire panzer unit was defeated, not by the enemy, but by the very air around them? This is the story of how thick fog led to one of Germany's most embarrassing tank defeats of the war. It's a story of bad luck, bad decisions, and how a division went from a fighting force to a grim historical footnote. This is the story of the 22nd Panzer Division. By early 1942, the war on the Eastern Front had become a brutal, grinding nightmare. The initial lightning successes of Operation Barbarossa were a distant memory, replaced by the unforgiving Russian winter. The German war machine was stretched thin. In the south, the Crimean Peninsula was a critical battleground. The German commander, General Feldmarschall Erich von Manstein, needed to secure the region to protect vital Romanian oil fields. Opposing him was the Soviet Crimean Front, a formidable force dug in and determined to push the Germans out. In March 1942, the Soviets launched a major offensive. Von Manstein, a man who believed in audacious action, needed to hit back hard. He looked to his armored reserves and his eyes fell on a newly arrived formation, the 22nd Panzer Division. On paper, a Panzer Division was a powerful weapon, but the 22nd was different. It was hastily formed in France in late 1941, a product of Germany's desperate need for more tanks on the Eastern Front. Its equipment was a motley collection of second-rate machines. Instead of the formidable Panzer IIIs and IVs, the 22nd was largely equipped with captured French tanks and, most critically, the Czech-built Panzer 38T. By 1942, the Panzer 38T was a relic. Its armor was thin, and its 37mm cannon was dangerously underpowered against the revolutionary Soviet T-34 tank. The 22nd was one of the very last Panzer divisions to be saddled with the 38T as its main battle tank. An official evaluation even noted the division wasn't fully ready for action, but the situation in the Crimea was dire. Ready or not, the 22nd Panzer Division was about to be thrown into the fire. To understand the catastrophe that was about to unfold, you have to understand the flawed tool at the heart of it. The 22nd Panzer was not one of the celebrated, battle-hardened divisions from the glory days of 1940. It was a latecomer, cobbled together to plug the ever-growing gaps on the Eastern Front. The division's makeup told a story of logistical strain. It had a core of those Panzer 38Ts, supplemented by older Panzer IIs, which were basically reconnaissance tanks, and even some captured French models that were a mechanic's nightmare for spare parts. The star of this underwhelming show was the Panzer 38T. It was a solid light tank back in 1939, reliable and relatively fast. But tank technology was moving at a ferocious pace. By 1942, on the Eastern Front, the 38T was a death trap. Its 37mm gun had been fine against Polish and French tanks, but it was almost useless against the sloped armor of the Soviet T-34. A T-34's armor was brilliantly designed to make small shells, like those from a 38T, just bounce off. To have any chance, a 38T crew had to get perilously close and hope for a lucky shot at a weak spot, all while knowing a single 76mm shell from the T-34 could tear their own tank to pieces. Worse, the 38's armor was riveted. A solid hit could cause the rivets to fly around inside the hull like lethal shrapnel. The men crewing these tanks knew exactly what they were driving. They were being sent to fight a new war in an old machine. That kind of knowledge eats away at your confidence. The division's commander, General Major Wilhelm von Appel, was an experienced officer, but he was leading a unit that was undertrained, under-equipped, and had never fought together. In February 1942, they were loaded onto trains and sent to the Crimea, arriving just as the spring thaw was turning the landscape into a muddy quagmire. They were hurried to the front, meant to be von Manstein's trump card. The stage was set. The players, however flawed, were in position. All that was missing was the final, fatal element. The date was March 20th, 1942. The orders were clear. The 22nd Panzer Division's 204th Panzer Regiment was to launch a counterattack against the Soviet 51st Army. It was supposed to be a classic Panzer operation, a swift, focused punch to sow chaos and stop the Soviet offensive in its tracks. But as the sun failed to rise that morning, it was clear this would be anything but classic. A thick, wet, disorienting fog had rolled in from the Sea of Azov, blanketing the flat, featureless steppe. Visibility was down to just a few meters. Commanders couldn't even see the front of their own tanks, let alone the one next to them. For a tank unit, this is a nightmare. Armored warfare is all about movement and observation. The entire principle of blitzkrieg breaks down when you can't see where you're going. Radio communication, already spotty in these early war tanks, became a confusing mess without visual confirmation. The regiment's commander faced a terrible choice. His orders were to attack at 6 a.m. Disobeying a direct order from a man like von Manstein was unthinkable. The pressure to act was immense, but to advance blindly into an enemy-held battlefield? That was inviting disaster. The risk of getting lost, separated, and stumbling into an ambush was incredibly high. The decision was made. The attack would proceed. You can imagine the thinking, a rigid adherence to orders, maybe an underestimation of the enemy, and a fatal hope that the fog might actually hide them from Soviet eyes. It was a massive gamble. At 6 a.m., with a roar of engines that was quickly swallowed by the oppressive silence of the fog, the tanks of the 204th Panzer Regiment lurched forward into the gray abyss. They were driving quite literally into the fog of war. The advance was agonizingly slow. Inside the tanks, the world became a claustrophobic, churning hell. Commanders had to button up, peering through narrow vision slits that were like frosted glass. Drivers strained to follow the vague shape of the tank in front, their knuckles white. The plan fell apart almost immediately. The two detachments that were supposed to advance side by side quickly lost contact. Formations disintegrated. Companies, platoons, and individual tanks drifted apart. Each crew was now isolated, alone in a sea of gray, knowing the enemy was somewhere out there, waiting. One of the detachments, veering off course, wandered into a sector the Soviets had identified as a likely avenue of attack. Here they had prepared a grim welcome. Dense minefields. The lead panzers had no idea they were driving into a death trap until the first catastrophic explosion ripped through the fog. A tank lurched, its track blown clean off. Crippled, it was now a sitting duck. A moment later, another tank met the same fate. Then another. Panic set in. The column ground to a halt, trapped between the mines ahead and their own disoriented comrades coming up from behind. Meanwhile, the second detachment was stumbling into an even worse fate. Their own confused navigation had led them directly toward the main Soviet defensive line. This wasn't just a trench, it was a prepared kill zone. The Soviets, masters of camouflage, had dug in dozens of their 45mm anti-tank guns. These guns were small, easy to hide, and at the close ranges dictated by the fog, they were deadly. Their crews waited with disciplined patience, listening to the growing rumble of the German tanks. The German tankers thought the fog was their cover. In reality, it was their shroud. It funneled them into a tight, perfect target package and delivered them right to the enemy's doorstep. For the Soviet gunners, it was the perfect ambush. They just had to wait for a dark shape to emerge from the gray wall and then open fire. The moment the ambush was sprung was pure chaos. The fog thinned in patches, and in those fleeting moments of clarity, the German crews saw a vision from hell. They weren't hitting the enemy's flank. They had driven straight into the teeth of a multi-layered defense. The landscape lit up with the muzzle flashes of dug-in anti-tank guns. The sharp crack of the Soviet guns was followed instantly by the thud of shells on thin German armor. For the crews of the Panzer 38s and Panzer IIs, it was a slaughter. Shells tore through the hulls, turning the tiny crew compartments into a blender of shrapnel and molten metal. Tanks erupted in flames as their own ammunition cooked off. Hatches flew open as burning crewmen tried to escape, only to be cut down by machine gun fire. The radio net dissolved into a cacophony of screams. "We're taking fire from the front, from the right. They're everywhere." But there was nowhere to go. Reversing meant crashing into the tanks behind them. Advancing meant driving deeper into the kill zone. As if that weren't enough, the Soviets unleashed their own tanks. The 55th Tank Brigade slammed into the flank of the reeling German column. Now, the Germans were being hit by T-26 and T-34s from the side. A few surviving German commanders tried to organize a defense, but it was hopeless. Their 37mm shells sparked harmlessly off the T-34s. The Panzer IIs might as well have been firing pea shooters. They were outgunned, disoriented, and caught in a perfect crossfire. By 9 a.m., less than 3 hours after it began, the attack had utterly failed. The order was given to retreat. The few surviving tanks scrambled back to their own lines, leaving behind a smoldering graveyard of their comrades. Historian Robert Forczyk later called it one of the most badly bungled German armored attacks of the entire war on the Eastern Front. It was a stunning, humiliating defeat. When the survivors limped back to German lines, the scale of the disaster became horrifyingly clear. The butcher's bill was staggering. In a single morning, the attacking units suffered a 40% casualty rate among their men. The material losses were just as devastating. Accounts suggest around 32 tanks were lost, destroyed, or damaged beyond repair. This included 17 of the obsolete Panzer 38Ts and 6 of their more valuable Panzer IVs. For a single regiment in a 3-hour fight, this was a crippling blow. The 22nd Panzer Division, sent to be a key reinforcement, had been broken in its very first major battle. In the short term, the German counterattack was a spectacular failure. Von Manstein would later recover and clear the Kerch Peninsula in May. Notably, during that successful operation, he kept the battered 22nd Panzer in reserve until after his infantry had secured a breakthrough. A clear lesson learned from the disaster in the fog. But the story of the 22nd Panzer didn't end there. The debacle of March 20th was more than just a tactical failure. It was a prophecy. It was a grim foreshadowing of the division's entire cursed existence. This was just Chapter 1. After the Crimean campaign, the division was refitted and sent north for Case Blue, the massive 1942 summer offensive toward Stalingrad. As the German 6th Army pushed toward the city, the 22nd Panzer Division was given a new job, defending the long, exposed northern flank. They were the fire brigade, meant to back up the overstretched Romanian and Italian troops holding the line. It was a critical job, and the division sent to do it was about to be undone by an enemy far smaller than a Soviet tank. As autumn 1942 settled over the steppes west of Stalingrad, the 22nd Panzer settled into its new role. The fighting in the city was a maelstrom, but on the flanks, things were eerily quiet. The weather grew cold. To protect their tanks from the harsh winter, the crews took what seemed like a sensible precaution. They dug their panzers into the earth and packed straw around the hulls for insulation. For weeks, many of the tanks sat idle in these shelters, their engines silent. But they weren't alone. The warm straw proved to be an irresistible winter haven for the local field mice. This next part sounds like a grim joke, but the core fact is undeniable. The division's readiness was rotting from the inside out. Unseen, an army of rodents made their homes inside the German war machines, and they chewed. They chewed through the rubber and plastic insulation covering the tank's electrical wiring. Day after day, the delicate nervous systems of the panzers were systematically gnawed to shreds. On the surface, the tanks looked fine. Underneath, they were being fatally compromised. Meanwhile, the Soviet High Command was preparing the greatest surprise of the war, Operation Uranus, a classic pincer movement on a gargantuan scale, designed to smash the weak flanks held by the Romanians and trap the entire German 6th Army. The 22nd Panzer Division was directly in the path of the northern pincer. They were the armored fist that was supposed to smash any Soviet breakthrough. On November 19, 1942, Operation Uranus began with a deafening artillery barrage that shattered the Romanian lines. 1 million Soviet soldiers and thousands of tanks surged forward. The order came down to the 22nd Panzer Division: start your engines, counter the breakthrough, and across the division, a disaster unfolded. Drivers hit the ignition, nothing. Or worse, a flurry of sparks and the acrid smell of burning wires. The mice had done their work. Radios were dead. Turret mechanisms failed. Engines refused to start. Out of a division that should have had over 100 tanks, Only about 30 were able to respond. The fire brigade had no water. The handful of tanks from the 22nd Panzer that could move drove straight into a hurricane. They were hopelessly outnumbered. A tidal wave of steel, led by hundreds of superior T-34s, descended upon them. The 30-odd obsolete panzers were like pebbles trying to stop a flood. Command and control completely broke down. Contradictory orders sent the depleted forces scattering in multiple directions. In the desperate battles that followed, the 22nd Panzer Division was not just defeated, it was effectively erased from the map. The crews fought with courage, but the outcome was never in doubt. Tank after tank was destroyed. Units were surrounded and annihilated. The division disintegrated. Survivors abandoned their wrecked vehicles and tried to escape on foot. But there was no stopping the Soviet juggernaut. Within days, the trap slammed shut. The German 6th Army was encircled. The road to Stalingrad was paved with the wreckage of the 22nd Panzer Division. The division's fate was sealed. It officially existed on paper for a few more months as a ghost formation, but in April 1943, the 22nd Panzer Division was formally disbanded. Its story is a perfect microcosm of the German war on the Eastern Front. It starts with hubris, transitions to a brutal lesson in the Crimean fog, and ends in a state of systemic collapse, symbolized by mice chewing through wires. From its bungled debut to its ignominious end, the 22nd Panzer Division was seemingly cursed. Its history isn't one of heroic charges, but a more common and important story of how attritional warfare, logistical neglect, and simple bad luck can destroy an army. The saga of the 22nd Panzer Division is a stark reminder that the fog of war isn't just a metaphor. On March 20th, 1942, it was a literal physical blanket that led an entire armored unit into a death trap. That disastrous morning was an embarrassing failure and a textbook example of how not to conduct an armored attack. Yet that was just the prologue. The division's ultimate destruction 8 months later wasn't because of one bad decision, but systemic decay. The image of its tanks, immobilized by mice, is a powerful symbol of the German war machine's hidden fragility. The failure of the 22nd Panzer to hold the flank wasn't a minor setback. It was the critical breach that allowed the Red Army to encircle and destroy the 6th Army, marking the great turning point of the war in the East. The story of this cursed division, from the fog of Crimea to the mice of Stalingrad, is a powerful counter-narrative to the myth of the invincible Panzer Force. It shows that war isn't just about brilliant generals or brave soldiers. It's about logistics, equipment, timing, and luck. And when all of those things turn against you, as they did for the 22nd Panzer, even an iron fist can crumble into dust. If you found this look into a forgotten, disastrous battle interesting, be sure to subscribe for more stories from the front lines of history. Your support helps us uncover these lesser-known events that shaped the Second World War. Let us know in the comments what other battles or units you'd like to see us cover.